What is going on, everyone? James Hancock here. I'm back to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the fantasy genre, specifically the explosion of fantasy movies that took place back in the 1980s. With so many fantasy shows on the horizon like The Witcher over at Netflix and The Wheel of Time at Amazon, the fantasy genre is heating up in a big bad way. As most readers of fantasy can tell you, the 21st century has been a true golden age for this genre, with so many great series by writers like Joe Abercrombie, Brandon Sanderson, Steven Erikson, R. Scott Bakker, George R. R. Martin, and many, many more. But for younger fantasy fans out there who didn't get to experience the 80s firsthand, but are curious about the ebb and flow of the popularity of the fantasy genre, I thought it'd be fun to cook up a list of my favorite fantasy films from the 1980s, a time where the genre enjoyed a genuine boom, almost like the eruption of spaghetti westerns back in the 1960s. I'm not arguing that the fantasy movies of the 80s were as good as the great spaghetti westerns, but a lot of Italian filmmakers did get in on the action and made a hell of a lot of movies in the fantasy genre. Something was just in the water in this decade. Not only was there a steady stream of fantasy movies, but I was getting seriously interested in playing Dungeons and Dragons, reading fantasy novels, playing early computer games like Wizardry on the Apple II. All these factors led to my becoming a lifelong fan of the fantasy genre, an interest that I maintain to the present day, where a similar surge in the genre appears to be taking place. Some might argue quite reasonably that I'm overstating the importance of sword and sorcery back in the 1980s, but you have to remember that I was born in 1976, making me the perfect target audience for this trend. It was pretty common for mom and pop video stores in the 80s to have a section devoted exclusively to the fantasy genre, and the poster art for these films was truly legendary, promising worlds and experiences that no movies could ever hope to equal. But I was completely bewitched by these illustrations of bulging muscles and scantily clad women. As far as I was concerned, there was no such thing as a bad fantasy movie. In preparation for this video, however, I revisited a lot of movies that I had not seen since childhood, and I tried to look at them as objectively as possible without getting too lost in nostalgia. Sadly, I no longer cling to my childhood delusion that there's no such thing as a bad fantasy movie. On the other hand, time has been very kind to many of these movies, many of which I now regard with total confidence as genuine movie classics. The scale, scope, and quality of these movies, it's all over the place. Some of these films are perfectly respectable Hollywood extravaganzas or animated movies designed for the whole family, while others are unintentionally funny, low-budget oddities like Hercules, where we see Lou Ferrigno quite literally hurl a bear into space. The sheer variety is staggering, and I should also add that this genre attracted the attention of so many fantastic directors, including John Milius, Ridley Scott, Lucio Fulci, John Borman, Jim Henson, Don Coscarelli, Richard Donner, Ralph Bakshi, and Wolfgang Peterson, to name but a few. But it is of equal importance to acknowledge those movies that were so disreputable and so embarrassing to be associated with that even well-known grindhouse filmmakers like Jack Hill and Joe D'Amato chose to work under pseudonyms rather than damage their reputations by using their real names. That's what I love about the fantasy films of this period. These movies can range from tales of high adventure geared toward a younger sensibility to shameless exploitation movies that feel like any second they could easily slip into something closer to softcore porn. Suffice to say, if you're into loincloths, exposed butt cheeks, oily tanned skin, and glistening muscles in either men or women, this is definitely the genre for you. But the big question is, how do we define the fantasy genre? This is totally subjective for every fantasy fan. My definition leans more toward the dark sword and sorcery adventures described by authors like Robert E. Howard, but an equally valid definition could be one far more innocent in tone that feels more like a fairy tale. Just to make my list more manageable, I decided not to include any traditional historical sword and sandal, medieval, or caveman movies that take place in our own actual ancient history here on the planet Earth. That said, the myths and legends of those periods are totally fair game. Folklore is also another tricky genre, but the really slippery stories are those that combine the high tech of science fiction with sword and sorcery. As a kid, I obsessively played with my Masters of the Universe action figures, and part of the appeal of that fictionalized universe was its unique blend of technology and medieval fantasy. But as I made my list, I found myself excluding any movies that feature prominently futuristic technology. But in a move that might feel wildly inconsistent with what I just said, I did include some movies that take place in the modern era that incorporate fantasy elements. My point is that no matter what definition I go with, there will be some inconsistencies, but when it comes to the fantasy genre, you kind of know it when you see it, but I'll do my best to justify my choices as I go. So before I sink my teeth into my official top 10 list, because this is an overview of the fantasy genre in the 1980s, I need to give a shout out to some honorable mentions. I love and adore these movies and caught many of these in the theater as a young child. Any and all of them could have easily made my top 10, but they didn't quite make the cut. So my honorable mentions are Krull, Legend, Willow, The Last Unicorn, the 1980 animated movie of Return of the King, The Never-Ending Story, Lady Hawk, The Secret of Nim, and The Dark Crystal. I know that will be complete total heresy to many of you for excluding those movies, but in my defense, I will say I consider all of these to be essential fantasy films of the 1980s, movies that I watched on repeat, and the fact that I was able to leave so many great fantasy movies off of my list proves just how rich a period the 1980s were for the genre. If I had made my list at age 14 at the end of the decade, my list probably would have ended up quite different, but at age 43, my list tends to lean much toward the world of sword and sorcery and dark adult fantasy, just because that's the style of fantasy I more often than not enjoy these days, both in books and in video games. More than ever, I find that fantasy feels strangely incomplete in the absence of black magic, secret death cults, soul-sucking demons, human sacrifice, all that good stuff. But there's another category I need to discuss that I affectionately refer to as dishonorable mentions. If I limited myself exclusively to my top 10 or movies that are actually good, I wouldn't be able to give a complete picture of just how many ill-conceived, but oftentimes very entertaining, trashy sword and sorcery movies were being made at this time. Many of these projects have been forgotten, but for the last week or so, I've immersed myself in the adventures of forgotten movies like Hawk the Slayer, Lucio Fulci's Conquest, Thor the Conqueror, and Hundra. A lot of these movies seem to have spent the majority of their limited budgets on gorgeous-looking posters, which to my young eyes made them irresistible, which is how I ended up watching movies like The Sword and the Sorcerer on repeat on VHS. With so many of these dishonorable mentions, the well-honed, well-oiled, naked bodies of the characters are clearly the feature attraction. Movies like Sorceress from 1982, starring the beautiful twins Lynette and Lee Harris, who've been raised as boys to protect their true identities. And then you have the David Carradine vehicle, The Warrior and the Sorceress, where his co-star pretty much remains topless for the entire movie. And if you look closely at the poster, you'll see another noteworthy selling point of the flick, and no, you are not seeing double. Probably the most notorious franchise of this era, or the most amazing, depending upon your point of view, is Deathstalker. Most folks know of this series of movies because of the absolutely glorious posters illustrated by the great Boris Vallejo, who was responsible for some of the wildest posters of this era like Barbarian Queen. Honestly, no movies could ever hope to equal the intoxicating worlds promised by so many of these posters, but I do think the first Deathstalker flick is well worth a look. By any objective measure, the movie's pretty weak, but if you prefer your fantasy movie to be light on plot and even less on clothing, Deathstalker is the fantasy movie every horny teenager secretly wants to see. This is one of those flicks where being topless poses no obstacle whatsoever if you're ready to go into battle. Deathstalker 2 I find to be basically unwatchable, but if you're a fan of softcore porn star Monique Gabrielle, well, your choice is clear. But my dishonorable mentions would be incomplete without mentioning the Ator franchise, a series of 4 movies starting with Ator the Fighting Eagle in 1982. Apart from his love of hairspray and his 0% body fat and his wide range of skills he seems to employ, Ator does not have a whole lot to offer. When it comes to fantasy, just about every negative stereotype and genre cliche is on full display in this series, so much so that the second film, Ator 2 The Invincible, aka The Blade Master, aka Cave Dwellers, depending upon which version of the movie and which territory you're actually watching, but the movie was just too enticing for Mystery Science Theater to resist. In any event, I'm not the world's biggest fan of watching stuff just to laugh at it in a condescending fashion, but if that is your thing, the Ator movies will definitely make you very happy. So finally, with all the preliminaries out of the way, some of y'all might be thinking it's about goddamn time, but it's time we get down to it. Let's discuss my top 10 fantasy films of the 1980s. First up, number 10, we have a movie that was one of my earliest movie-going experiences that I still remember quite clearly, Clash of the Titans. It ignited a lifelong love of Greek mythology, and while the movie might take some big liberties with the myths upon which it's based, I didn't know that at age 5. I proceeded to collect all the action figures, except for the Kraken, which I never managed to get my hands on. The main draw of this movie is the fact that this was the last feature film to feature the extraordinary stop-motion special effects of one of the great wizards of cinema, the great Ray Harryhausen. The cast is pretty extraordinary as well, with legends like Laurence Olivier, Maggie Smith, Burgess Meredith, and the great Ursula Andress. Also, for a PG movie, this flick has an impressive amount of nudity, a recurring theme throughout much of this video, as I'm sure you've noticed. You gotta love the 80s. But perhaps one of these days, Hollywood will realize that a series of faithful adaptations of Greek mythology could unlock the greatest shared universe ever seen on the big screen. But for now, in spite of this movie's shortcomings, Clash of the Titans is one of those movies that makes my heart soar every time I watch it. Number 9. Next up is yet another movie from 1981, which proves just how hardcore rated PG movies used to be in comparison to the risk-averse PG-13 flicks we're exposed to in 2019. But I'm talking about Dragon Slayer, a very simple and effective movie with a very simple and descriptive title. As a Dungeons & Dragons freak as a kid, this movie had a massive impact on my imagination and the types of adventures I enjoyed constructing once I became a dungeon master. More importantly, this movie is a strong contender for the best dragon I've ever seen on the screen in terms of its look, how it flies, its breath weapon, all of it. What I really enjoy is watching how a bumbling, well-intentioned wizard's apprentice is forced to adapt and pick up a spear and a dragon-scale shield when his limited arcane knowledge proves to be insufficient for the task at hand. But best of all is his master, played to perfection by Ralph Richardson, who does a brilliant job of elevating this material into the stratosphere, in particular when he throws down and faces the dragon in single combat. When it comes to good old-fashioned classic sword and sorcery, Dragon Slayer's tough to beat. Number 8. This movie didn't make much of a dent in the theater when initially released, but it rapidly became a cult classic on cable television, mostly because of kids my age watching it every time it came on. So if you're watching cable back in 1982, I imagine you remember this movie very well, but we have The Beastmaster. I watched this film for the first time in decades the other day, and I was blown away by how well it holds up. Director Don Coscarelli is known primarily for his horror franchise Phantasm, and I love just how many horror ingredients he includes in this movie, like the completely insane death guards, the man-eating winged devourers, and most terrifying of all, the great Rip Torn as Mayax, may he rest in peace, who regularly sacrifices young children into a pit of fire. But the reasons an entire generation of children embrace this movie are obvious. The movie features a hero who can talk to animals, opening the door to so many classic scenarios featuring the eagle, the giant cat, and the ferrets, who are his closest companions. I had so many vivid, strange flashbacks revisiting this movie, like remembering the way kids on the playground would imitate the Beastmaster and how he calls out to his eagle companion. And for those folks out there who like their fantasy heroes to wear as few clothes as possible, this film features a fine variety of scantily clad men and women like the lovely Tanya Roberts and the equally impressive and totally studly John Amos as Seth, who likes ripping off his clothes in dramatic fashion right before he beats the shit out of people. But in all seriousness, this is an excellent tale of high adventure and deserves to be seen by any fantasy fan. Producer Dino De Laurentiis was so impressed, he actually offered Don Coscarelli the gig of directing Conan the Destroyer, a gig which Coscarelli ended up turning down, but we'll get to the Conan movies in a bit. Number 7. So it's finally time to talk about a movie that, as Ricky Bobby famously stated, won the Academy Award for Best Movie Ever Made. From 1986, Highlander, a movie which features my second favorite 80s training montage in any fantasy film. We'll get to my favorite in a bit, but just the soundtrack by Queen would make this movie worthy of an honorable mention. This is one of those movies where it's tough to articulate why it works so well. It either speaks to you or it doesn't. I know it doesn't work for a lot of people, but everything about it just sings to me. As a kid, I would recreate the sword fights with my friends. Even now in my 40s, I found myself quoting it incessantly, especially when trying to get fired up at the gym. Kurgan, played by the great Clancy Brown, probably the most metal villain of the 1980s, but what really brings this movie together is the relationship between Connor McLeod and his mentor Ramirez, played with absolute relish by the great Sean Connery. Watching them running on the beach in Scotland and practicing their swordplay on rocky cliffs overlooking the ocean is just sheer bliss. As far as I'm concerned, fantasy cinema doesn't get any better than that. Number 6. It's hard to think of a more famous fantasy illustrator from the 20th century than Frank Frazetta, which I'm rocking out on my t-shirt. Just looking at his Conan covers absolutely secures him Hall of Fame status, but in 1983, he teamed up with animator Ralph Bakshi for one of my all-time favorite animated movies, Fire and Ice. As if the crew were not already stacked enough with incredible talent, the film was also written by comic book legends Jerry Conway and Roy Thomas, both of whom wrote their fair share of Conan stories from Marvel Comics. What makes this film so unusual visually is the rotoscoping process used, where the animated cells are essentially painted over live-action footage, making the actions and the movements of the characters incredibly fluid. But in the end, the appeal of this movie is the phenomenal characters like Darkwolf, Necron, and a strong contender for one of the most beautifully animated characters of all time, the Mighty Tigra. And then along these same lines, for my number 5, I'm going with a short film that is part of yet another animated classic, Heavy Metal from 1981. Drawing its inspiration from the lurid tales of Heavy Metal magazine, this flick presents us with an anthology of hysterically funny and intensely erotic sci-fi and fantasy vignettes. But because this list is a list of my favorite fantasy films, I'm going with the one pure raw fantasy story of the bunch, Den, based on the work of yet another legendary illustrator, Richard Corbin. Voiced by comedy giant John Candy, the story features a teenage boy hurled into another dimension and transformed into the bald-headed, muscle-bound badass we come to know and love as Den. He proceeds to kick all kinds of ass while taking the occasional break to make love with the most voluptuous women you've ever seen. Best of all is John Candy's ongoing narration, which makes this easily the funniest fantasy story ever caught on film. There's a good chance I've seen this short more than any other short film ever made, and I urge you to follow my example. All right, I'm starting to sweat. This video's taking a long time to record. But number 4, if you're tired of hearing me talk about all the amazing TNA in these movies, my next choice is much more innocent, much more wholesome. So far, I've avoided movies that come too close to feeling like a fairy tale, but this movie is so well executed that it just can't be denied. From 1987, The Princess Bride. I went to see this movie on my second date ever. I wish I could say it was my first. Sadly, that honor belongs to Ernest Goes to Camp. But The Princess Bride is easily one of the most stirring, charming, heartwarming adventure movies ever made. And best of all, it's a tale about true love. But from its epic fencing sequences to its sparkling wit and humor, courtesy of writer William Goldman, who wrote both the book as well as the screenplay, it's safe to say that The Princess Bride is a strong contender for the best fantasy adventure movie ever made. So I had to do some soul searching for my number 3. In terms of my love for the movie, it could have easily taken the number 1 slot, but I couldn't quite say with certainty if it belongs with these other movies in terms of how it's defining the fantasy genre. The flick does have plenty of swords and sorcery, but it's also a brilliant homage to Hong Kong cinema and features Kurt Russell doing one of the best John Wayne impersonations I've ever seen. I'm of course talking about John Carpenter's immortal classic, Big Trouble in Little China. In my opinion, one of the most gleefully entertaining movies ever conceived by a human being. But as much as I love the martial arts, the 3 storms, the villainous David Lo Pan and his Chinese black magic, what I love most is the friendship and camaraderie between Jack Burton and Wang. I've seen this movie countless times, but every time I watch it, I'm nearly brought to tears at the end when Jack tells his friend, "We really shook the pillars of heaven, didn't we, Wang?" Perhaps it is a stretch to include this film with other traditional sword and sorcery movies and fantasy movies, but if Highlander can make the cut, I figure why not this as well? Number 2, we're getting down to the heavy hitters now, and it's time to talk about one of my all-time favorite movies in any genre, John Boorman's epic adaptation of the Arthurian legends, Excalibur. What's funny about my early experiences watching it as a kid in the early 80s is how I'd often catch it on HBO during a period where HBO was frequently playing Monty Python and the Holy Grail as well. Because I so rarely got to see these movies right from the beginning, and because I was just so young, I'd frequently get these movies totally mixed up in my head, not knowing if I was about to crack up or be absolutely terrified by Mordred hanging the quest knights from a tree to be pecked at by ravens. At any rate, years later, when I started renting both movies on a regular basis, I was finally able to separate the 2 movies in my mind, and I pretty much love everything about Excalibur, including the rather over-the-top roaring that so many characters indulge in when speaking their dialogue. The cast is awe-inspiring with so many legends like Patrick Stewart, Liam Neeson, Gabriel Byrne, Helen Mirren, and best of all, Nicol Williamson as Merlin. One of my favorite fantasy buffs, Tony Stella, has justifiably criticized the armor designs for having no relevance whatsoever when it comes to historical accuracy, but when I'm watching myths and legends, I'm not necessarily that interested in historical accuracy. I just want the characters to look like total badasses, and they completely do. But what really solidifies this movie as one of the all-time greats is its use of music. With generous helpings of Richard Wagner and Carl Orff, this film's soundtrack fuels me with enough adrenaline that I feel like I could take on Morgana and Mordred's forces all by myself, which gives me the perfect segue into my number 1 choice, a movie that makes me feel like I can run through walls each and every time I see it, a movie that stands alone atop the mountain of sword and sorcery movies, and one that I don't think will ever be equaled. From 1982, Conan the Barbarian. I love everything about it. This is the definition of pure, dark, epic fantasy. It features a score that could raise the dead. The screenplay is absolutely first-rate with so many quotable lines, but I especially love the epic voiceover narration. Arnie was obviously born to play this part, but Sandahl Bergman, she's a true Valkyrie. And then you have acting giants like James Earl Jones and Max von Sydow absolutely chewing the scenery. Director John Milius and screenwriter Oliver Stone very wisely chose to lean into all the darkest elements of Robert E. Howard's source material, constructing a story filled with black magic, death cults, human sacrifice, orgies, cannibalism, you name it. But as stirring as the training montages and battle sequences might be, what this movie has that so many fantasy movies lack is a philosophy. That philosophy is expressed in so many classic scenes, but what gets me every time is Conan's prayer to Crom right before the last battle of the film. People rarely give Arnie credit for his acting chops, but that scene in particular gives me goosebumps from head to toe. Sadly, neither Conan the Destroyer nor Red Sonja, where Arnold Schwarzenegger plays a Conan lookalike named Calidor, but neither of these movies were able to replicate the creative heights of Conan the Barbarian. Conan the Destroyer has some great moments like Grace Jones offering romantic advice to a young princess.
Grab him and take him.
But it's truly a shame that Arnie wasn't able to re-team with Milius or another filmmaker on his level like Paul Verhoeven to give us more stories featuring our favorite Sumerian. In any event, I'll draw this to a close, urging anyone who hasn't heard it yet to listen to the commentary track recorded for Conan the Barbarian featuring Arnold Schwarzenegger and director John Milius. You will laugh like hell and quote it for the rest of your life. So I've come to the end of my quest. I hope you enjoyed my list. I'm still not completely satisfied with my strict definition of fantasy for this list, in that I really wanted to include movies like Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind, but dystopian futures and high tech disqualified that remarkable movie, at least as far as this list is concerned. But leaving out so many classic movies just gives me the perfect excuse to do a similar list with dystopian 80s science fiction at some point down the road. Just saying that makes me want to get started on that immediately, so I'll definitely be doing more lists like this in the future. But if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to my channel. It's very helpful to me. Give the video a like. Consider sharing it. It took me a long time to watch all the movies getting prepared for this video, so I would really appreciate it. But if you want to talk about fantasy, you can find me on Twitter at Colbrax, or leave me a comment in the comments below. But can't thank you enough for watching. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.